You have made it to Unit 4. This is the last unit of microbiology here, and this is where we look at the infectious diseases. This is where we learn the majority of infectious diseases, so the ones caused by bacteria and the ones caused by viruses. Those are the ones we deal with most often. So Unit 4 has a different format in terms of the exam and the quiz from other units, in that, again, just like you saw when we studied the fungi and the protists, we're looking at questions like what organism causes this disease and what disease fits this description. So I give you either a description of a disease and then I ask you what causes it, or I ask you what disease is it. This is mostly multiple choice, but there will be a lot of choices to sift through. So the more you can memorize different types of information about each disease and each pathogen, the better you're going to be. But always the first thing to study is what organism causes what disease. So that's where you start. So the best way I recommend studying is with something like a flashcard where you spatially organize the information. So in the upper left corner, you might put the organism. In the upper right, you might have something like the common signs and symptoms. In the lower left, you might have something like common treatments or prevention. And then on the other side, you have the name of the disease, or something like that. And the point of that is that with one card, you can cover up part of it and test yourself on that one thing, or you can cover up all but that one thing and test yourself on it. You just have a lot of options for how to study once you've made those. The other thing you can do is sort them. So be looking at the information and put all of the gram-negative bacterial pathogens on your left and all the gram-positive bacterial pathogens on your right. And that's a way of spending some time studying the gram-negative ones, looking to your left, spending some time studying the gram-positive ones, looking to your right, and then when it's time for the quiz or the test, you may remember which way you were facing when you studied this one. And that would be a way to remember gram-negative versus gram-positive. That's just an example of the kinds of things you can do with spatial organization as you study. Okay, so along with telling you about the typical exam questions I would ask, these are the ones I will not ask. And I tell you this so that you can aim the way you study in the right direction. So I'm not going to ask you to list signs and symptoms of most diseases. So you don't have to memorize every single sign and symptom. The more you memorize, the easier it's going to be, and the faster it's going to be to answer the questions on the exam. But if you don't have to be exhaustive and memorize every last thing, that can save you time. And so let me explain a little more. It's that I want to make a situation where you don't have to have memorized every detail. I want you to memorize as much as you can, and the more you memorize, the more it helps you. But I'm not going to penalize somebody for not having memorized one thing, if that makes sense. So if you forget what phylum a pathogen is in, that's okay. That's just a clue you don't have when you're trying to answer this kind of question. So you want to have all the clues you can get. And I'm also not asking you to do diagnosis. Diagnosis is a specific tool set that you would not learn in an intro microbiology course. But again, if you're interested in diagnosis, the textbook has a chapter on it. And this book has a lot on it, and it's interesting if you're curious about this stuff. But neither of those resources are necessary for studying Unit 4. So here are the things to study in Unit 4 as we go through it. Start always with the causative agent. Is it bacterial, gram-negative, gram-positive? Most of these will not be fungal, but many will be viral. And what kind of genome do they have? Do they have envelopes? Are they large or small? What kind of capsid shape do they have? What is the patient going to experience? Will they have typical signs and symptoms? What will that look like? So how would you tend to recognize it or know if you had it? And then what determines when this disease happens? What are the risk factors? In some cases, they're as simple as talking to someone. In others, you would have to be exposed to urine from an infected bat. There's a completely terrifying virus that is not in the US yet that you get from the urine of an infected bat. And so things like that, if it's that distinctive, those types of things are great to remember because that's all you will need to answer the question. If that were one of our diseases on the exam, I could say, this is a weird disease you get from the urine of a bat. And if you memorize that one thing, that's an easy question for you. So, risk factors, know those. The epidemiology is also going to be important. How common is it? How rare is it? Do you expect to see it in a clinic or don't you? How is it spread? What governs how common it is? So, like, is there asymptomatic spread? Is it airborne or droplet or contact or sexually transmitted? Those sorts of things. And then how do we prevent it? Do we have a vaccine? Do we have to just do things like social distancing? And are treatments routine? Do we have over-the-counter things you can use? Do we only have extremely toxic drugs, or do we have no drugs? There are viruses where we have no drugs to treat them. What's a little bit new here is that I will talk a little bit about virulence factors, especially for the bacteria, but when we go more into detail about any one pathogen, I'm likely to want you to know a few of the virulence factors so that you can understand the pathology. And so if I mention a virulence factor in the context of pathology or if I mention a virulence factor in the context of a specific disease, you should know it. In other cases, I'll give you a long list of virulence factors, and you don't have to memorize those long lists. Okay. So, what should you ask yourself when you first see a pathogen in the slides? One question you should be asking yourself is, why is this pathogen included in this course? What is it about the pathogen that makes it important? And it's going to be things like, is it going to be common in clinics? Is it something everybody experiences? Is it something severe that we need to know how to treat? Is it something terrifying that is a bioweapon and that we will hopefully never see, but you need to know it in case you do see it? Things like that are important because that's always going to be part of a description I give you on the exam, and that's all stuff we should all know. And if I give you multiple slides, look at all of them. The only slides you can skip are the ones that have the little letters CUR up here for curiosity. You can skip those if you want to. This is a little bit different from what I showed you earlier in the term. Again, I will provide icons when they make sense. And these are ways I can show you a little bit more about some of these diseases. So if you see a skull and crossbones, it's an intoxication. That means the symptoms and signs of the disease come from a toxin that is released by organisms. So where this makes the most sense is gastrointestinal infections, like food poisoning is a pure intoxication. If you eat poisoned food, like food that has the botulism toxin in it, you will get sick even if the bacteria that made that toxin are all dead. So a sterilized food with dead bacteria in it, nothing live, that contains the bacterial toxin, well, that will still give you food poisoning. So that's an intoxication. Irritations or disease. These are not like common clinical things. These are informal classes that I use to help simplify these things for you guys. So irritation is not a word that I've seen elsewhere, but it's the best thing I could come up with for these, which are situations where the pathogen doesn't really cross an epithelial barrier, but it still causes disease. Invasions are where the pathogens do cross an epithelial barrier and they can move through connective tissue or elsewhere in the body. In these diseases, some of these diseases, these get blurred a lot. So for example, there are several diseases caused by the staphylococci and the streptococci where they grow, and during an infection they release nasty toxins, and those toxins absolutely are the ones that cause the noticeable signs and symptoms. And so I'll put 2 of these in there. I'll give you 2 of these icons. Also, there are several diseases where the microorganisms are invasive, but they get trapped by the immune system. So most of the time, they are not able to do invasion. And so I'm giving you this 4th icon to show you that they have the possibility of invading tissues, but they don't because of a typical immune response. Okay, so that's the kinds of things you're going to need to get these slides. And just bear with me. You'll be able to figure out what these mean from the slides, but I'll also explain them. So I'll see you in the next video, and we will look at diseases of the skin.